This is the body camera footage from Officer Frank Miller, badge number 734, on Saturday, June 12th. The incident began with a routine noise complaint in a quiet suburban cul-de-sac. It ended with an $86 million federal lawsuit, the termination of a decorated officer, and a city's police department being placed under federal oversight. The man at the center of the controversy was David Sterling, a father celebrating his son's 10th birthday party in his own backyard. Officer Miller approached the home, believing he was dealing with a standard public nuisance. What he failed to understand was that he was not confronting a suspect. He was confronting the very system designed to hold him accountable. The man he placed in handcuffs, in front of his crying child and shocked neighbors, was a senior prosecutor for the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, the division that puts cops like him in prison. What follows is the anatomy of a career-ending mistake, a textbook case of racial profiling where a cop's arrogance collided with a father's hidden and immense authority. The sound of children's laughter was the first thing that should have tipped him off. It wasn't the raucous yelling of a drunken block party. It was the high-pitched shrieks of joy from a dozen 10-year-olds playing tag and Marco Polo in a swimming pool. A bouncy castle, bright red and yellow, inflated proudly near the back fence. Music, a clean pop playlist, played from a small Bluetooth speaker at a volume that barely reached the sidewalk. David Sterling stood at the grill, a plain blue apron tied over his simple t-shirt and cargo shorts, a spatula in one hand. He was focused on the perfect char for the burgers, a small smile on his face as he watched his son, Caleb, cannonball into the pool. This was his sanctuary, a world away from the depositions, the courtrooms, and the grim case files that defined his professional life. This was just about being a dad. The sudden appearance of the black and white patrol car at the curb felt like a glitch in the simulation. It coasted to a stop, its presence an immediate and unwelcome intrusion. The laughter of the children didn't stop, but a new, anxious silence fell over the adults who were mingling on the patio. Officer Frank Miller stepped out of the car. He didn't just exit. He emerged, planting his polished boots on the pavement with a sense of deliberate ownership. His hand rested habitually on his duty belt. He surveyed the scene not with curiosity, but with a pre-written judgment flickering in his eyes. He saw a well-appointed house in a predominantly white neighborhood, a gathering of black families in the backyard, and his mind filled in the blanks with its own irritangu. He didn't see a father, a birthday party, or a community. He saw a problem to be managed. David saw him coming. His smile faded, replaced by a practiced neutrality. He put the spatula down, wiped his hands on a towel, and walked calmly toward the driveway to meet the officer, creating a buffer between the law and his family. He knew the protocol. Stay calm. Be respectful. De-escalate. Good afternoon, officer, David began, his voice even and polite. Is there something I can help you with? Officer Miller stopped a few feet away, his stance wide, confrontational. He tilted his head, a gesture of condescending authority. He ignored the greeting. We got a noise complaint, he stated, his voice flat, accusatory. Gonna need you to shut this down. The timestamp on the body cam footage read 2:14 p.m. The city ordinance for noise violations didn't begin until 10 p.m. David knew this, not just as a citizen, but as a man who had cross-examined officers on the specific language of municipal codes hundreds of times. I understand, officer, David replied, keeping his tone deferential. But I believe we're well within the legal limits for a Saturday afternoon. It's my son's birthday party. The kids are just excited. Miller's eyes narrowed. He interpreted David's calm, factual response not as cooperation, but as a challenge. He saw a black man telling him the law, and his ego bristled. I didn't ask you what you believe, Miller snapped, taking a half-step closer to crowd David's space. I gave you an order. Kill the music and get these people to quiet down. Or I'll start writing citations. The other parents had stopped talking. They watched from the patio, their plastic cups frozen midway to their lips. A few of them discreetly pulled out their phones, the dark screens reflecting the tense scene. The bouncy castle sighed as if deflating under the weight of the moment. David held his ground, his posture relaxed but rooted. He refused to be intimidated in his own home. With all due respect, officer, he said, his voice still low and steady. You can't issue a citation for a non-violation. The music is at a reasonable level, and the sound is from children playing. There is no legal basis for your order. This was a mistake. Not a legal mistake, but a strategic one. He was dealing with a man who didn't care about the law, only about power. To Miller, David's precise language was the talk of a lawyer, a troublemaker who knew just enough to be difficult. Oh, a real smart guy, huh? Miller sneered, a cruel smile twisting his lips. He unclipped the radio from his shoulder. Think you can talk your way out of this? I'm the law here. Now, I'm going to ask you one more time. Shut it down. The unspoken threat hung in the air between them. Or else. The or else was what David's entire career was built on fighting. He saw it in the officer's rigid posture, the tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze flickered over David not as a person, but as an obstacle to be cleared. He recognized the pattern, the familiar script of an encounter spiraling out of control because of an officer's bruised ego and unchecked bias. He could have complied. He could have turned off the music, told the kids to be quiet, and placated this man's fragile authority. It would have been the easy thing to do. But standing on his own property, in front of his son and his friends, compliance felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for. It felt like teaching his son that their joy was conditional, subject to the whims of any uniformed man who disliked the color of their skin. So he made another choice. He stood his ground. Officer, I am not shutting down my son's birthday party because of an unsubstantiated and likely baseless complaint from a neighbor, David said, his voice gaining a new firmness. If you believe a law is being broken, please cite the specific ordinance. Otherwise, you are welcome to leave my property. The challenge was laid bare. The officer's face flushed a deep, angry red. You're refusing to obey a lawful order, Miller hissed. That's obstruction of justice. Now I want to see your ID. Now David sighed softly. He had hoped to avoid this. He slowly reached for his back pocket, moving with deliberate, non-threatening slowness. I'm happy to provide my identification, officer, but I want to state for the record that I am doing so under protest. You have no reasonable suspicion that I have committed a crime, and therefore this is an unlawful demand. He pulled out his wallet, a simple leather bifold, and retrieved his driver's license. As he handed it over, his wife, Sarah, came walking quickly down the driveway. She was a pediatrician, and her default mode was calm, reassuring authority. She placed a gentle hand on David's arm. Is everything all right, officer? She asked, her voice filled with polite concern. I'm Dr. Sterling. This is our home. The kids were just a little loud. We can absolutely ask them to quiet down. Miller barely glanced at her. His focus was a laser beam of animosity directed at David. Ma'am, you need to step back inside, he commanded, waving a dismissive hand at her. This doesn't concern you. Sarah didn't move. It certainly does concern me. This is my husband and my home. We haven't done anything wrong. I said, step back. Miller barked, and he took a step toward her, using his body to physically block her. He put his hand on her shoulder, not violently, but with an unmistakable firmness, a gesture of pure dominance meant to push her away. That was the line. The absolute, uncrossable line. David's entire demeanor shifted. The practiced calm evaporated, replaced by a cold, protective fire. His voice dropped an octave, losing all traces of deference. It was now the voice he used in federal court, a voice that could silence a room. Get your hand off my wife. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. The command was laced with an intensity that made Miller flinch. The officer saw it as the final provocation he'd been waiting for. This was his justification. That's it, Miller yelled, turning his full attention back to David. You're done. You're under arrest for obstruction and intimidating an officer. Turn around. Hands behind your back. He lunged for David, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind his back with practiced, painful efficiency. David didn't resist. He knew better. Resisting would only escalate the violence and muddy the legal waters. He went limp, allowing the officer to maneuver him. But he did not go silent. I am not resisting arrest, he said loudly and clearly, for the benefit of the watching phones. I am being unlawfully detained. I have committed no crime. From the yard, a child's wail cut through the air. Daddy, it was Caleb. He stood by the pool, his face streaked with tears, his small body trembling as he watched two other mothers try to shield his eyes. The sight of his son's terror was a physical blow to David, harder than any punch. It was the deepest humiliation, the one thing he had always worked so hard to prevent. his son seeing him as powerless, as a victim. The metallic click of the handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed in the sudden, dead silence of the cul-de-sac. The party was over. Miller shoved David toward the patrol car, his grip unnecessarily tight. "Not so smart now, are you?" he muttered. The words a venomous whisper meant only for David. He yanked open the back door and pushed David inside. The back of the cruiser was a cage of hard plastic and stale air, scorching hot from the afternoon sun. The door slammed shut, and for a moment, David was alone with the sound of his own breathing and the frantic beating of his heart. He closed his eyes, forcing down the surge of rage and fear. He could see Caleb's face, twisted in confusion and sorrow. This image would be seared into his memory forever. This was no longer just about a noise complaint or a racist cop. This was about his son. Miller was on his radio, his voice triumphant. "Dispatch, show 1 in custody. Adult male, disorderly conduct, obstruction of justice. I'll be en route to central booking shortly." Through the cage, David could see Sarah arguing with Miller, her voice rising in panicked desperation. The neighbors were now a small crowd on the sidewalk, their phones held high, a silent chorus of witnesses. Just then, a second patrol car pulled up, this one with a sergeant's stripes on the sleeve of the officer driving. Sergeant Evans got out, his expression a mixture of annoyance and concern. A simple noise complaint should never require a supervisor. He walked over to Miller, his body language questioning. "Miller, what the hell is going on here?" Evans demanded, his voice low but audible through the open window. "I've got 3 calls about this already. You arrested a guy at a kid's birthday party." Miller launched into his defense, painting David as an aggressive, uncooperative agitator. "He was belligerent from the start, Sarge. Refused my orders, got in my face. His wife tried to interfere. I had no choice." Evans listened, his gaze shifting from Miller to the crowd of onlookers, to Sarah's distraught face, and finally, to the silent man in the back of the cruiser. He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This was a paperwork nightmare. He walked over to the back door and peered in at David. "All right, let's hear your side of it," Evans said, his tone weary. David met his gaze. His face was a mask of pure, unflinching composure. The fear and anger were still there, but they were now fuel, channeled into a cold, diamond-hard resolve. "Sergeant," David began, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Before this situation deteriorates any further, I suggest you take out a pen and paper. You are going to want to document this conversation with extreme precision." Evans blinked, taken aback by the man's tone. It was not the voice of a common arrestee. It was a voice accustomed to being obeyed. "My name," David continued, speaking slowly and deliberately, "is David Sterling. Sterling." He paused, letting the name hang in the hot, stagnant air. "I'd like you to run that name through the Federal Employee Database. You can cross-reference it with the Bar Association Registry for the District of Columbia." A flicker of uncertainty crossed the sergeant's face. He glanced back at Miller, who was watching with a smug grin, still high on his adrenaline. David leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Evans. He delivered the next sentence with the calm, devastating finality of a judge handing down a life sentence. "I am a senior trial attorney for the United States Department of Justice. I work in the Civil Rights Division, specifically within the Special Litigation Section." He let that sink in for a moment, watching the sergeant's mind process the information. Then he delivered the killing blow. "My section," he said, his voice dropping to an icy whisper, "is responsible for conducting pattern or practice investigations into police departments for unconstitutional conduct. We are the people who sue and prosecute police officers for a living. And your officer Miller has just volunteered to be the star witness in our next investigation into this department." The world seemed to stop. The body cam footage, shaky and unstable, captured the exact moment Sergeant Evans understood the magnitude of the disaster. His face went slack, the color draining from it, as if a plug had been pulled. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He staggered back a step, his eyes wide with a dawning horror that was almost comical. He turned to look at Miller, whose self-satisfied smirk was frozen on his face, the meaning of David's words not yet having penetrated his thick skull. "What did he say?" Miller asked, confused. "Some kind of federal lawyer?" Evans didn't answer. He was fumbling for his radio, his hands trembling. "Dispatch, hold that transport," He stammered into the mic, "Hold transport." Supervisor on scene, he turned back to Miller, his face now a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "Miller, you idiot. Get him out of the car. Get those cuffs off him now." The command was a shriek. Miller finally seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation. His confident posture dissolved, and he shrank in on himself. He looked at David in the car, then at his sergeant, his face a canvas of confusion and fear. "But Sarge," he obstructed. "Now, Miller." Evans roared, his voice cracking. Miller scrambled for the door, his hands shaking so badly he could barely fit the key into the lock. He fumbled with the handcuffs, his fingers clumsy and slick with sweat. The cuffs sprang open. David slowly brought his hands in front of him, rubbing the raw, red marks on his wrists. He stepped out of the car, not as a suspect, but as an adjudicator. He stood tall, his simple t-shirt and shorts now seeming like the robes of a judge. The entire cul-de-sac was silent, watching this incredible, instantaneous reversal of power. The phones of the witnesses were all trained on Officer Miller's ashen face and Sergeant Evans's frantic attempts at damage control. "Sir," Evans began, his voice pleading. "Sir, I am so sorry. There has been a terrible misunderstanding. Officer Miller is he's a newer officer. He doesn't save it, Sergeant." David cut him off, his voice like a shard of ice. His eyes were fixed on Miller, who was now staring at the ground, unable to meet his gaze. "Your officer's tenure is irrelevant. His actions, however, are very relevant." David turned his attention back to Evans, his expression unreadable. "Sergeant, I am giving you two direct instructions. First, you will relieve Officer Miller of his duty weapon and place him in the passenger seat of your vehicle. He is not to interact with any member of the public. Second, you are to secure his body camera and all related footage immediately. Consider this a formal request for evidence preservation." He took a step closer to the trembling sergeant. "A team from my office will be here on Monday morning. They will have subpoenas for every single complaint ever filed against Officer Miller, his training records, his performance reviews, and every piece of digital communication related to this incident. My wife, who your officer assaulted, will be giving her statement. So will every one of these witnesses." He gestured to the neighbors still filming. "This is no longer a traffic stop, Sergeant. This is now a federal civil rights investigation. You and your chief will be hearing from the United States Attorney General's office before the end of the day. Do you understand me?" Sergeant Evans could only nod, his throat working but producing no sound. He looked utterly broken. David gave him one last, withering look before turning and walking back up his driveway. Sarah rushed to him, throwing her arms around him, her body shaking with residual fear and anger. He held her tight for a moment, then gently pushed her back and looked toward the yard. Caleb was still standing there, watching him, his tears finally subsiding, replaced by a look of awe. David walked over to his son, knelt down, and pulled him into a fierce hug. "It's okay, buddy," he whispered into his son's hair. "Daddy's okay. Everything is going to be okay," but he knew it wasn't. Nothing would be the same. The sanctity of his home had been violated, his son's innocence scarred. This would not end with an apology. It would end with accountability. The aftermath was swift and brutal. By Monday, Officer Frank Miller was suspended without pay. By Wednesday, he was fired. The city's mayor and police chief held a televised press conference, offering a profuse, hollow apology to the Sterling family. It was too little, too late. David Sterling, acting as a private citizen, filed an $86 million lawsuit against the city, the police department, and Frank Miller personally. The lawsuit cited unlawful arrest, malicious prosecution, assault, and the violation of his and his family's civil rights. The city's lawyers, knowing they were facing a top DOJ prosecutor with an airtight case backed by a dozen videos, immediately sought to settle. The final settlement included a multi-million-dollar payment, which the Sterlings donated in its entirety to a national nonprofit dedicated to police reform and legal aid for victims of police brutality. But David demanded more than money. As part of the settlement, the city agreed to enter into a federal consent decree, a legally binding agreement to overhaul its police department's policies on use of force, training, and community relations. The process would be overseen by an independent monitor. The monitor chosen by the Department of Justice was, in a move of profound and vindicating irony, David Sterling himself. He would not just be the victim. He would be the architect of the solution, the man responsible for ensuring that what happened to him would never happen to another family in that city again. The body cam footage from that day went viral, a stark and infuriating lesson in racial bias and the abuse of power. But for those who watched it, the most powerful moment wasn't the arrest or the anger. It was the quiet, unshakable dignity of a father who, in the face of humiliation, refused to surrender his power, and in doing so, transformed a moment of personal injustice into a catalyst for systemic change. Months later, on another sunny afternoon, the sound of laughter once again filled the Sterling's backyard. David was at the grill, flipping burgers, his son Caleb playing catch nearby. The memory of that day was still there, a faint scar on a beautiful landscape, but it no longer held the same power. It was a reminder not of what they had lost, but of what they had fought for and won.